Evelyn May Carter carried herself with the kind of pride that came naturally to women of the Deep South. She was 56, but her posture was ramrod straight, her chin lifted as if she were forever being watched by the eyes of her neighbors. She liked it that way. Her pearls, always her pearls, set neatly around her neck, a symbol of tradition and authority. Evelyn was the kind of woman who had an opinion about everything, and she rarely left it unsaid. To her, family meant loyalty, respect, and obedience, though in practice those values often seemed to revolve around her own comfort. Her son, James Carter Jr., had grown up under that shadow. He was a gentleman, the kind who worked quietly in information technology and spent his free hours reading manuals or tinkering with computers. He was clever in his own way, but soft where it mattered most. To Evelyn, that softness was a sign that he needed her guidance. To Rachel, his wife, it was the one flaw that left their marriage vulnerable to constant interference. Rachel was nothing like her mother-in-law. Where Evelyn was rigid, Rachel was open and kind-hearted, teaching second graders at the elementary school just outside Birmingham. She wore simple clothes, spoke with warmth, and valued privacy in a way Evelyn never could. Rachel had grown up believing a marriage was a partnership of two, not three, and certainly not under the watchful eye of a mother-in-law who let herself in without knocking. The conflict came to a head one warm Saturday morning. They had gathered at James and Rachel's modest apartment, a place the young couple had been so proud to make their own. The air carried the smell of coffee, and sunlight stretched through the blinds, but the room felt tense even before Evelyn opened her mouth. She had been circling the subject for weeks, making casual comments about emergencies and break-ins, until finally she set down her mug and announced what she wanted. "I'll just keep a spare key," Evelyn said, her voice firm, as though it were the most reasonable request in the world. You never know when something could happen. Fires, accidents, medical scares. What if James collapses while you're out, Rachel? What if there's a gas leak? Someone has to be able to get in. Rachel froze. She had expected it, but hearing the words aloud still made her chest tighten. "We appreciate your concern, Evelyn," she replied evenly, "but we don't need anyone else with a key. If there's ever an emergency, we'll handle it, or we'll call the authorities." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that carried more judgment than kindness. "Honey, don't be foolish. I'm not saying I'll barge in. I'm talking about safety. Every responsible family keeps someone close with a key. It's just common sense." James shifted in his chair. His eyes flicked from his wife to his mother, his shoulders already tense with the weight of having to choose. He knew Rachel was right. He knew that privacy was important, that their home should belong to them alone. But he also knew what Evelyn expected. She wasn't asking. She was insisting, the same way she had all his life. To say no to her would be an act of defiance he wasn't ready to make. "Mom," James began carefully, "we'll think about it. Maybe we can leave a key with a neighbor instead." "A neighbor?" Evelyn cut in, her voice sharp. "Strangers? You'd trust them over your own blood? James, I raised you better than that." Rachel swallowed hard, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "It's not about blood, Evelyn. It's about boundaries. Our apartment is our private space. I don't want anyone, neighbors or family, letting themselves in." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed louder than ever. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her pearls glinting in the morning light. She had no intention of backing down, and Rachel knew it. James lowered his gaze, guilt swimming in his expression. By the end of the conversation, the decision was clear. James, caught between the two women he loved, gave a hesitant nod when his mother pressed the matter again. "It's just for emergencies," he said softly, though the word sounded more like surrender than reassurance. Evelyn's smile returned, wide this time triumphant. She reached for the small brass key on the counter, sliding it into her purse as if it had belonged to her all along. "There now," she said, smoothing her skirt. "We're all settled. Nothing to worry about." Rachel sat frozen in her chair, the taste of bitterness in her mouth. She watched as Evelyn gathered her things, as the door closed behind her with a quiet thud, and she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It wasn't just a key Evelyn had taken, it was permission, an open door into their lives. And Rachel knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that trouble was coming. The first time Evelyn used the key, she told herself it was harmless. James and Rachel had both left for work. James heading to the IT office where he spent most of his days behind a screen, Rachel to her classroom where 20 children awaited her. Evelyn waited until she knew the street was quiet, then slipped into their apartment building with the same confidence as if she owned the place. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and in seconds she was inside. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the lavender candles Rachel liked to burn in the evenings. Evelyn wrinkled her nose. She found the little space cramped compared to her own home, too modest, too ordinary for her son. "A Carter deserves better than this," she muttered under her breath as she set her purse on the counter. She began with the excuse she had already prepared in her mind. She poured a glass of water, looked around the living room, and said aloud, though no one could hear, "Just making sure everything is in order. Just watering the plants." She touched the leaves of a fern near the window, giving them a small shake as though that counted. But her curiosity didn't stop at the plants. Evelyn moved into the kitchen, opening cabinets one by one. She inspected the dishes, frowned at the mismatched mugs, then pulled open the refrigerator. Rows of plastic containers with neatly labeled meals lined the shelves. Rachel's doing, no doubt. Evelyn scoffed. All this fuss over leftovers. Where's the real food? She reached for the freezer door and tugged it open. That was when she saw it. Behind bags of frozen vegetables and an ice tray, tucked neatly in the corner, was a plain white envelope. Evelyn lifted it out, her fingers tingling with anticipation. She tore the flap open just enough to peek inside and drew a sharp breath. Bills, stacks of them. Neat, crisp hundreds, all banded together. She counted quickly, her hands steady despite her racing heart. $5,000 at least. She stared at the money for a long moment, her pulse quickening. What kind of young couple kept that much cash hidden in a freezer? It wasn't safe. It wasn't smart. But above all, to Evelyn it felt like a secret they shouldn't be keeping from her. She slipped the envelope back, closed the freezer, and smoothed her blouse as if nothing had happened. Yet the knowledge of it burned in her mind. Her exploration didn't stop there. Evelyn wandered into the bedroom, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She pulled open Rachel's dresser drawers, running her fingers over folded blouses. She picked up a silk scarf, held it to her throat, and smiled at her reflection in the mirror. Then she spotted a bottle of perfume on the vanity. She lifted it, uncapped it, and sprayed a single mist into the air. The scent of jasmine and vanilla filled the room. Evelyn inhaled deeply, closing her eyes as though she had claimed a part of Rachel for herself. When she left, she took care to put everything back in its place, or so she thought. That evening, Rachel came home first. She dropped her bag on the couch and headed straight to the bedroom to change. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. The top drawer of her dresser wasn't aligned the way she had left it. A silk scarf had been folded differently, and the faintest trace of her perfume lingered in the air. She frowned, scanning the room, her heart sinking with unease. In the kitchen, she opened the freezer to grab chicken for dinner. She stared at the corner where the envelope sat, its flap tucked just slightly differently than before. She reached for it, sliding it out with trembling hands. The money was still there, but something told her it had been disturbed. When James came home, Rachel was waiting. "Did you go through my things today?" she asked bluntly, holding the envelope in her hands. James blinked, confused. "What? No. I worked all day. Why?" "Someone's been in here. The drawers, the perfume, this envelope," she shook her head. "I can feel it." James sighed, setting down his laptop bag. Rachel, you're imagining things. Maybe you're just tired. Nobody has been in here. Rachel fixed him with a sharp look. Your mother has a key. Don't tell me it isn't possible. For a moment, James hesitated. His instinct was to defend Evelyn, to believe she would never cross such a line. She wouldn't do that, he said finally, his tone firm but unconvincing. You're overthinking it. Rachel pressed her lips together. She knew what she felt, and she knew she wasn't wrong. If you won't believe me, then we need proof. We're installing cameras. James rubbed his temples, already weary of the argument. He hated being caught in the middle, hated choosing sides between his wife and his mother. Fine, he muttered, if it'll make you feel better, but I think it's unnecessary. Rachel didn't answer. She turned away, clutching the envelope to her chest. Her instincts screamed that Evelyn had already crossed a line, and unless they stopped her, she would cross many more. Evelyn May Carter grew bolder with each passing week. What began as a quick check-in turned into long afternoons of silent exploration. She used her key with practiced ease, slipping inside when James and Rachel were away, her heels muffled against the carpet. At first, she told herself she was looking after her son, protecting his home. But her actions betrayed another motive. She wanted control. In the living room, she examined stacks of mail, carefully opening envelopes with a butter knife and resealing them before sliding them back into place. She scanned utility bills, bank statements, even Rachel's teacher contracts, absorbing every detail as though she had a right to know. She muttered to herself as she read, shaking her head at what she considered poor decisions. Too much spent on groceries. Too little saved for retirement. They wouldn't last a month without me. Her curiosity reached further into the private corners of their lives. She stepped into the bedroom and rifled through Rachel's nightstand, frowning at notebooks filled with lesson plans. She found a photograph of Rachel with her parents, smiling at a picnic table, and stared at it with pursed lips. They'll never care for James the way I do, she whispered. Even the laundry wasn't safe from her interference. One morning, she opened the washer mid-cycle and reset the settings, convinced Rachel didn't know how to treat delicate fabrics. She left clothes damp and wrinkled in the basket, sure Rachel would blame herself. To Evelyn, these intrusions felt like minor corrections. To Rachel, though she couldn't yet prove it, they felt like violations. Rachel's unease deepened with each discovery. A pile of letters stacked the wrong way, a washing machine dial she knew she hadn't touched, the faint smell of Evelyn's perfume clinging to curtains. Every time she raised her suspicions, James dismissed them. She wouldn't, he said again and again. You're letting your imagination get the better of you. My mom might be stubborn, but she's not a criminal. Rachel's frustration grew sharp enough to sting. She stood in the kitchen one evening, the envelope of cash gripped tight in her hands. She knows James. I don't know how, but she knows about this money. And if you won't believe me now, don't say I didn't warn you when it disappears. James rubbed the back of his neck, unable to meet her eyes. Rachel, please, you're talking about my mother. But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the tiny thread of doubt that wound through his chest. Meanwhile, Evelyn found new inspiration from an unexpected source. One afternoon, she stopped by the small antiques shop on the corner, a place she often visited to chat with Mrs. Harrington, a widow in her 70s who had lived in Birmingham all her life. Mrs. Harrington delighted in sharing stories of heirlooms and treasures, her voice laced with nostalgia. That day, she pulled Evelyn aside with a conspiratorial smile. You have an eye for fine things, don't you? She said, motioning toward a glass cabinet. Inside sat a porcelain vase, its surface painted with delicate blue patterns that shimmered under the light. Early 19th century, came from a plantation estate upstate, worth far more than the price they're asking. Evelyn leaned closer, her breath catching. The vase stood regal and flawless, a symbol of history and wealth. She could imagine it on her mantel, a centerpiece for her living room. Proof to every visitor that she, Evelyn Carter, still carried refinement and taste. "How much?" she asked, her voice hushed. 2,000, maybe 2,500, Mrs. Harrington replied. "A steal if you ask me. An investment. In a few years it could double." The word lingered in Evelyn's mind, investment. It made her scheme feel less like theft and more like a clever financial decision. She imagined presenting the vase to James and Rachel, convincing them it was for the family, their legacy. They might even thank her one day. But she knew she didn't have the cash. Her savings had dwindled after years of maintaining her own home, and she wasn't about to touch her credit cards. She needed money quickly, and she already knew where to find it. That night, Evelyn sat alone at her kitchen table, the idea taking root. She folded her hands over her pearls and whispered to herself, "That money in the freezer, it's wasted there gathering dust. They don't know how to use it wisely. I'll take a portion, just enough to buy the vase. They'll see it as an investment. It's not stealing. It's safeguarding their future." She tapped her nails against the wood, her plan crystallizing. She would take 2,500, maybe 3,000 at most. Enough to purchase the vase, but not so much that they would notice right away. If questioned, she could always insist she borrowed it. In her mind, it was a perfect solution. Evelyn smiled faintly, the vision of that porcelain vase glowing in her thoughts. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, about leaving her mark in her son's household. Soon, she told herself, they would thank her. But far beneath the surface of her reasoning, something darker pulsed. She wasn't investing in the family's future. She was investing in her own power, and she didn't care what line she had to cross to claim it. For weeks, Rachel had pressed James about installing cameras. Each argument ended with him sighing, rubbing his temples, and insisting that it was unnecessary. But after another tense evening, he finally relented. "Fine," he said. "If it makes you feel better, we'll put them up." The following Saturday, a technician arrived to repair and set up their Nest cameras, one in the living room and another in the hallway by the bedroom. Rachel felt the faintest wave of relief when the tiny green lights blinked to life. James remained unconvinced. "It's a waste of money," he muttered, shaking his head. But he let it go and the cameras stayed. Evelyn knew nothing of this. 2 days later, when both James and Rachel were at work, she came again. The key slid into the lock, the door opened, and she stepped inside with her usual self-assured calm. Her heels tapped across the hardwood as she glanced around. The apartment was quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of candles Rachel had burned the night before. Evelyn set her purse down, just as she always did, and went straight to the freezer. She opened it, pulled the envelope free, and slid out a neat stack of bills. Her lips pursed as she counted. $2,500, folded carefully into her handbag. She smoothed her skirt afterward, standing taller, convincing herself the act was justified. "For their own good," she whispered. But she wasn't done. Her eyes caught the small jewelry box on Rachel's dresser. She opened it, lifted a pair of pearl earrings, and held them to her ears. They glistened in the mirror. She laughed softly, the sound carrying through the empty room. She slipped them back, though not quite in the same position, then sprayed a puff of Rachel's perfume onto her wrist. Finally, she opened the nightstand drawer. Inside lay a simple USB drive labeled in Rachel's neat handwriting. Family photos. Evelyn turned it over in her hand, smiling at the idea of possessing even their memories. Without hesitation, she slipped it into her purse. What Evelyn did not know was that every movement had been captured. The camera lens, small and silent, had recorded her theft in crisp detail. The counting of bills, the earrings at her ears, the USB disappearing into her bag. That evening, Rachel arrived home and followed her usual routine. But something compelled her to check the Nest app on her phone. She opened it, scrolled through the day's footage, and froze. There, in perfect clarity, was Evelyn, her mother-in-law, her face, her hands rifling through the freezer, her smile in the bedroom mirror. the jewelry dangling from her ears. And then, unmistakably, the envelope of cash being tucked into her purse. Rachel's chest tightened, her breath caught. She sat on the edge of the couch, the phone trembling in her hand. The sight of Evelyn pocketing the USB drive stung even more than the cash. It was labeled family photos. That wasn't just theft. That was erasure. For weeks, she had doubted herself, argued with her husband, felt like a paranoid intruder in her own home. And now the proof was undeniable. Evelyn was not a guardian, not a matriarch protecting her family. She was a thief. By the time James walked in, Rachel's expression was carved in stone. She met him at the door without a word and pressed the phone into his hand. "Watch," she said. James frowned, confused, but tapped the play button. At first, he thought it was a mistake. The familiar apartment filled the screen, and then his mother appeared. He blinked, his brows knitting together. This can't be right." "Keep watching," Rachel whispered. His mother's image moved across the screen, opening the freezer, pulling out the envelope. James' jaw slackened. The sound of bills flicking together came faintly from the recording. She laughed softly in the bedroom as she tried on Rachel's earrings. Then came the USB, pocketed without hesitation. James' face drained of color. He dropped onto the couch, staring at the screen as though it might dissolve. "No," he said. "That's not her. That's not my mom." "It is," Rachel said, her voice shaking with anger and vindication. "You told me I was imagining things. You told me she wouldn't. Look at her, James. She's in our home. She's stealing from us." He couldn't speak. The evidence was irrefutable. His mother, the woman he had defended again and again, stood exposed before him as nothing less than a thief. Not borrowing, not protecting. Stealing. Rachel leaned closer, her eyes fierce. "Now you understand. This isn't paranoia. This isn't some misunderstanding. She's violating our lives, and I will not let it continue." James swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he set the phone down. His entire image of Evelyn had cracked in a single moment, leaving him lost between loyalty and truth. For the first time, he saw his mother not as a guardian, but as a stranger, an intruder in his marriage, in his home, in his trust. Rachel straightened, her voice calm but firm. "It ends now, James. One way or another, it ends." The apartment was unnervingly quiet after the video ended. James sat on the couch with his head in his hands, staring at the floor as though it might give him a different answer. Rachel stood across from him, her arms folded, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. The silence stretched until James finally drew in a sharp breath and reached for his phone. "I'll call her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded once. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only resolve. "Do it." James dialed, the line clicking before his mother's familiar voice came through, warm and casual as always. "James? Is everything all right, sweetheart?" His throat tightened. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Did you come by the apartment today?" A pause. Then, with a hint of amusement, Evelyn replied, "Well, of course. I told you I'd check in. Someone has to make sure things are in order." "Did you take anything?" James asked, forcing the words past his lips. "Money? Jewelry? A USB drive?" Silence pressed against his ear, heavy and damning. When she spoke again, her tone was sharp. "How dare you accuse me of stealing? I am your mother." "We saw you," James said, his voice cracking. "On the cameras. You were caught, Mom. It's all there." Evelyn's laugh was brittle. "That money? I was only borrowing it. For something important. I would have told you. And the other things, I was just trying them on. You know me, James. I would never hurt you." Rachel stepped forward, her voice cutting through. "You did hurt us, Evelyn. You've been sneaking in, stealing from us, lying to us." "Stay out of this, Rachel," Evelyn snapped. "This is between me and my son." James closed his eyes. No, Mom. This is between you and the truth. The line went dead. Evelyn had hung up. Rachel grabbed her own phone. That's it. I'm done. She dialed 911, her hands steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers from the Birmingham Police Department arrived at the apartment. Their uniforms and calm professionalism filled the space with authority. Rachel wasted no time. She handed over her phone, pulled up the Nest app, and showed them the footage. The officers leaned in, watching closely as Evelyn appeared on the screen, removing cash from the freezer, slipping jewelry into her hands, pocketing the USB. One officer let out a low whistle. That's clear as day, he said. Do you want to file a theft report? Yes, Rachel answered without hesitation. Absolutely. James sat motionless, his face pale. He could barely nod when one of the officers turned to him for confirmation. His silence was consent enough. The officers began taking notes, recording details, asking for an itemized list of what had been stolen. Rachel provided it, her voice firm and unwavering. $2,500 in cash, she began. A USB labeled family photos. A pair of pearl earrings from my dresser. James added little, his words stumbling when he tried. A knock at the door interrupted them. Rachel froze. James looked up, dread in his eyes. It was Evelyn. She stood in the doorway with her purse over her arm, her expression stormy. "What's going on here?" she demanded, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Her eyes darted to the officers, then to her son. "James, what are these men doing in your home?" One of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions regarding stolen property." Evelyn's face flushed crimson. "Stolen? How dare you? That money was for the family. I was going to buy something meaningful, something valuable, a gift for all of us." Rachel's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You took it without asking. That's not a gift. That's theft." "I'm your mother," Evelyn snapped, her eyes blazing. "Everything I do is for you, James. Can't you see that?" James looked at her, his voice hollow. "All I see is you taking what doesn't belong to you." The officers asked Evelyn to sit down. Reluctantly, she did, though her posture remained stiff, her chin lifted in defiance. They explained the seriousness of the situation, the evidence they had seen, the theft report being filed. Evelyn shook her head, her voice rising. "This is madness. I didn't steal, I borrowed. I was going to replace it. You can't treat me like a criminal. I'm his mother." But the officers were unmoved. One of them wrote steadily in his notebook. The other stood watch, firm but calm. "Ma'am, intent doesn't erase the fact that you took money and property without permission. That is theft under Alabama law." Evelyn's protests grew louder, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic attempt to rewrite the truth. She claimed she had planned to surprise James and Rachel with the porcelain vase, that it would have become a family heirloom, that she was thinking of their legacy. But the video footage didn't lie, and in the silence that followed, with the officers watching and Rachel glaring, even Evelyn seemed to realize the walls had closed in. Her voice faltered, her excuses weaker each time she repeated them. Finally, she slumped slightly, her pearls catching the light as though mocking her. The officers gathered their notes, confirming they had what they needed. "We'll be forwarding this to the county prosecutor," one said. "You'll be contacted with next steps." Rachel exhaled, a deep, steady breath of vindication. James stared at his mother with eyes that no longer held blind devotion, only grief and disbelief. For the first time in her life, Evelyn May Carter was not in control. And she hated it. The ride to the precinct was short, but for Evelyn May Carter it felt like an eternity. The officers escorted her into the Birmingham Police Department, her pearls still resting proudly around her neck as if they might shield her from disgrace. She clutched her purse tightly, her eyes darting from face to face, expecting someone, anyone, to recognize who she was and intervene. But no one did. At the front desk, her name was taken down. A report was filed, her belongings inventoried. When they asked her to sit in a holding room, she did so stiffly, her back straight, her pride refusing to bend. She repeated her rehearsed lines to anyone who would listen. "I didn't steal, I borrowed. It was for the family. This is all a misunderstanding." But her words rang hollow against the sterile walls. James sat in the apartment long after she had been taken away, his head buried in his hands. Rachel moved through the room with quiet certainty, gathering papers, preparing for what came next. She had waited too long for clarity, endured too many arguments. Now, at last, the truth had forced itself into the open. "Rachel," James whispered, his voice breaking. "What have we done? She's my mother." Rachel stopped, turned to him, her expression unyielding. What she did wasn't love. It was theft. It was betrayal. "Enough is enough, James." She crossed the line, and now she faces the consequences. Her tone left no room for argument. For the first time, James couldn't retreat into denial. The image of his mother smiling as she pocketed their money and jewelry was burned into his mind. He could not unsee it, and he could no longer defend her. The weeks that followed unfolded with the slow weight of inevitability. The county prosecutor reviewed the case. The video evidence was clear. Evelyn May Carter was charged with felony theft, a crime that carried a heavy stigma even if her sentence turned out to be lenient. On the day of the hearing, Evelyn walked into the Jefferson County Courthouse in a tailored suit, pearls gleaming as always, her chin held high. She moved as though the entire town were watching, and in a way they were. Neighbors whispered in pews. Friends turned their faces away. And even those who had once envied her composure now studied her downfall with a quiet fascination. The judge listened patiently as Evelyn's lawyer argued she had no criminal record, that she was a respected member of the community, that the money had not been squandered but intended for an investment. None of it erased the video, which played on a large screen for the courtroom to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as Evelyn appeared, her hand sliding the envelope of cash into her purse, her smile reflected in the mirror as she tried on Rachel's earrings. The verdict was firm. Guilty. Her sentence: probation, community service, and restitution. She avoided jail but not shame. The words felony theft would follow her forever, stamped into her record like a brand. For Rachel, it was justice. For James, it was devastation. He stood in the hallway after the hearing, his shoulders hunched, his eyes red. Evelyn had looked back at him once as she left the courtroom, but there had been no reconciliation in that glance, only bitterness, as though she blamed him for failing to shield her. The true punishment came not from the judge, but from the community Evelyn had cherished for decades. Birmingham's southern circles were small, and word traveled quickly. Friends who once gathered with her at church luncheons now crossed the street to avoid her. Women she had led in garden club meetings shook their heads and whispered. Even at the grocery store, strangers cast sidelong glances, muttering under their breath. Her fall from grace was complete. Evelyn, who had built her life on reputation and appearances, found herself isolated. Invitations stopped arriving. The phone rarely rang. When it did, it was only to cancel a commitment, to politely but firmly close a door. At home, she wandered from room to room, her pearls heavy against her chest, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. She had believed she was untouchable, the matriarch who set the rules. Now she was nothing more than a cautionary tale told behind closed doors. James and Rachel, meanwhile, began to rebuild. For Rachel, there was relief in the silence, in the knowledge that boundaries had finally been drawn. For James, the silence was haunted, filled with guilt and grief. He had wanted to believe in his mother's love, but he could no longer deny the truth. The Carter family name had once carried weight in their neighborhood. Now it carried a stain, and Evelyn May Carter, once so proud, found herself facing the one punishment she could never endure: to be seen as less than perfect, to be cast out from the very society she had lived her life to impress. In the weeks after the verdict, Evelyn May Carter found herself living in a silence she had never known. The once busy phone, always ringing with invitations to luncheons, church committees, or garden clubs, sat motionless on the kitchen counter. Neighbors who had once waved from across the street now turned their heads away, as though her presence carried shame like a contagious illness. At the grocery store, she felt the eyes on her back. She caught whispers near the produce aisle. Two women she had once hosted for tea, murmuring words like theft and felony as if they were poison. Evelyn gripped her cart tighter, her pearls cool against her neck, the only remnant of her old armor. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be invisible and infamous at the same time. Friends she had considered lifelong allies cut her off without hesitation. One by one, church acquaintances sent polite but firm messages that they could no longer associate with her. The pastor, though kind, suggested she take some time away from her usual roles. The word stung. Evelyn had defined herself through her image in the community, and now that image had been shattered beyond repair. Alone in her house, she drifted from room to room, haunted by the emptiness. The walls felt closer, pressing in with every hour. She had always filled her days with activity, with people to impress, with appearances to maintain. Now, left with only her thoughts, she found herself face to face with a truth she could no longer escape. In the stillness of her living room, she heard echoes of her own past lessons. She had once taught James, when he was a boy, that honesty mattered above all things. "A Carter's word is their bond," she used to say, her finger wagging in the air. "If you break trust, you break yourself." She had repeated those words like scripture, drilling them into her son's young mind. And now, she realized, she had been the one to betray them most completely. At night, sleep offered no relief. Her dreams were fractured, filled with images of James as a child, running into her arms with trust shining in his eyes. Then the memory would shift cruelly sharp to his voice in the courtroom hallway, trembling and hollow. "All I see is you taking what doesn't belong to you." The words replayed over and over, each time cutting deeper. But the phrase that burned her the most was from that night in their apartment, when he had looked at her with grief in his face and whispered, "Mom, you've betrayed me." Those words clung to her like a shadow. She repeated them to herself in the quiet, until they became both confession and curse. I betrayed him. For the first time in her life, Evelyn felt the sting of regret, not as a passing discomfort, but as a permanent wound. She sat at her kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper before her, the tip of her pen hovering uncertainly. Her pride battled against her shame, but at last she began to write. The letter poured out slowly, haltingly. She wrote of her love for James, of her misguided choices, of how she had convinced herself that control was care. She admitted, in words that made her hands tremble, that she had stolen, that she had lied, that she had failed him as a mother. Tears smudged the ink as she wrote the final line. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you know I am sorry." Folding the letter carefully, Evelyn tucked it into an envelope. Late one evening, when the streets were quiet, she drove to James and Rachel's home. Her heart pounded as she approached the mailbox, slipping the letter inside. For a long moment, she stood there in the shadows, staring at the small metal door as though it could deliver her absolution. Then she turned away, her heels crunching softly against the gravel as she walked back to her car. Days passed, then weeks. Evelyn waited each morning for some sign. A phone call, a knock at the door, even a message in her mailbox. She replayed every possible outcome in her mind. James opening the letter, Rachel reading it aloud, the two of them softening, perhaps even offering a chance to talk. But no response came. The silence was crushing. The mailbox remained empty. The phone remained still. James and Rachel had chosen their answer, and it was absence. Evelyn sat in her quiet kitchen, the folded copy of her letter spread out before her. Her pearls felt heavier than ever, dragging against her collarbone. For the first time in her proud life, she understood what true separation meant. It wasn't distance measured in miles, but in trust broken beyond repair. And she realized, with a hollow ache that filled every corner of her being, that she might never be allowed back into her son's life again. 6 months slipped quietly through the Alabama heat. The Carter name, once a fixture in neighborhood gossip, slowly faded from daily conversation. People found new scandals to whisper about, new stories to chew on. But for Evelyn May Carter, the silence was no longer the absence of ridicule. It was the absence of connection. Her house stood as it always had, but she moved through it differently now. The blinds stayed open. The pearls lay untouched in their box. She wore simple cotton blouses, soft-soled shoes, her hair graying without the tint she once insisted upon. She began volunteering at the small public library downtown. At first it was awkward. Whispers followed her, recognition flickered in people's eyes. But the head librarian, a woman younger than Rachel, offered her a chance to shelve books and organize reading programs for children. Slowly, Evelyn built a rhythm. She found herself humbled by the work, stacking picture books with small hands tugging at her sleeves, listening to their laughter echo between the shelves. It was not the stage she once craved, but it was enough to remind her she could still be useful. For the first time in her life, Evelyn learned the quiet discipline of boundaries. She no longer asked questions that weren't hers to ask. She no longer inserted herself into lives she didn't own. Each evening, she returned home exhausted but calmer, the weight of her past mistakes still present, but softened by the small good she was doing. It was on a Saturday morning, when the air was heavy with the scent of magnolia, that she saw them again. She had gone to the farmer's market, carrying a simple tote bag instead of her designer purse, when she turned a corner near the produce stand. And there they were, James and Rachel. They walked together easily, Rachel laughing at something James said, her hand brushing his arm. Their smiles were natural, unburdened, free of the tension that had once filled their marriage. Evelyn froze, the breath catching in her chest. It was the first time she had seen her son since the courthouse, and the sight both hurt and soothed her. He looked older, steadier, happier. Rachel noticed first. Her smile faltered, her expression hardening into guarded neutrality. James followed her gaze and stiffened, his eyes landing on his mother. For a long moment, none of them moved. Evelyn's throat tightened, but she managed a small nod, her voice low when she spoke. James, Rachel. Rachel said nothing, her eyes cautious. James shifted, caught between instinct and history. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. I got your letter. Evelyn's heart stuttered. She clutched her tote bag tighter. You did. He nodded. I read it. Silence again, filled with the clamor of the market around them. The hum of voices, the calls of vendors, the shuffle of feet. Evelyn waited, bracing for rejection, for Rachel to pull him away. But James stayed, his gaze searching hers. I believe you meant it, he said finally, but it's going to take time. More than a letter, more than words. Evelyn swallowed hard, nodding quickly. I understand. I don't expect anything from you, not anymore. I just wanted you to know. I see what I did, and I'm sorry. Rachel remained quiet, her expression unreadable, but she did not pull James away. That alone felt like a gift. The conversation ended there. James took Rachel's hand, and together they walked on, disappearing into the crowd. Evelyn stood rooted in place, her chest aching but lighter somehow. He had read the letter. He had acknowledged her apology. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was not rejection either. That evening, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table once more, the house quiet around her. But this time the silence felt different. For the first time in months, it was not suffocating. It was waiting. She thought of the library, of the children's laughter, of the books lined neatly on the shelves. She thought of James' eyes, not warm, but not closed off either. She thought of Rachel's guarded silence, which might someday soften. It was not reconciliation. It was not healing. But it was a seed, planted in soil that had once been scorched. And with patience, perhaps it could grow. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, no pearls around her neck, no armor left to hide behind. She whispered into the stillness of her home, words meant for no one but herself. There is hope yet. And for the first time since her world had unraveled, she almost believed it. A year had passed since the day Evelyn May Carter's world unraveled. 12 long months of quiet mornings, volunteer shifts at the library, and evenings spent alone in a house that no longer felt like the center of anything. In that year, she had learned to live without the constant gaze of neighbors, without the invitations she once craved, without the validation she used to demand. The silence had become her teacher, forcing her to sit with the person she was and the one she might yet become. On a cool spring afternoon, an envelope appeared in her mailbox. It wasn't official mail, not a bill or statement, but a note written in James's familiar hand. She held it carefully, her fingers trembling before she even opened it. Inside was a simple message. Would you like to meet for coffee? Saturday, 2 p.m., Main Street Cafe. Evelyn read the words again and again, her eyes blurring with unexpected tears. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation home. But it was something she had thought might never come, a chance. When Saturday arrived, she took extra care, though not in the way she once would have. No pearls, no designer suit. Instead, she wore a plain gray cardigan over a soft blouse, slacks that had seen years of wear, and sensible shoes. Her hair, once religiously dyed, now framed her face in natural silver strands. She looked in the mirror and saw not the woman who had once ruled social circles with iron pride, but someone smaller, humbler, and perhaps freer. The cafe was quiet, a place